Hi, my name is Mariah Shaw, and this is my case presentation for HBSE, and I have the elderly population, the oldest group. So my case study is actually about a man named Doug, who I met when I was working in West Tulsa, Oklahoma, for a nonprofit called The Harvest. When I met Doug, he was very closed off, very gruff, and generally grumpy. This was endearing to me, so I kind of continued conversation, maybe when other people would be deterred by those behaviors. So a little bit of background, the Harvest, the nonprofit, had many different facets. It was spread pretty thin. One of the things that it did, though, was run a grocery store, because West Tulsa is a food desert, meaning that there's no produce, no fresh food available. So people could go to McDonald's or go to Quick Trip, a gas station, or they could go to the Harvest and buy groceries for an affordable price. So I actually worked as a cashier in this grocery store, and Doug would come in and sit at a table by my register. So during our time together, I began to see him open up quite a bit and laugh and joke regularly, which was encouraging. His social identities, he is a white heterosexual male of a low socioeconomic status. Other biopsychosocial components, he is single, he has 2 sisters, he has no kids, and he's never been married. He enjoys playing music, and he lives in government disability housing. He almost died of liver failure once, recently, before I met him. And those were relevant to our time together and our conversation. In terms of development growing up, I don't know much. I know that he is close to his sisters, that they don't live in state, and that he speaks of his childhood generally positively, though not specifically. He's always been a bit of a loner, though. Never any mention of close friends, of pastimes that involve other people, usually just playing music alone. He did go to college, and I'm not sure exactly how he felt on hard times. And in terms of his family context, I have similar limited background. So other than his 2 sisters, I've never heard about any family. That's pretty much all the information I have on family context. His strengths, he is resilient, certainly. After his liver failure, he struggles to walk, and yet he walks to the grocery store at least once a week to get the groceries he needs. He can't drive. Very few people in West Tulsa have cars, and so he makes that trip, even though it's hard for him. He utilizes his available resources. He receives food stamps and uses them, which is wise. He's musically talented, and he has a great memory for trivia and details from his past. The presenting problems would be that he lives in low-income housing, is on government disability, and suffers from poor health. He has no support system near him. Those sisters he references, I think they talk occasionally on the phone, but don't really act as a source of day in and day out support. And in terms of support in Tulsa, there's definitely none. It's hard for him to engage with people, and his options for people to engage with are limited because he's pretty isolated where he lives, and other people are struggling and also generally isolated in that community, unless you come from a huge family, and families tend to stick together. Of course, those are generalizations. So the changes that I saw in him over the course of our time together give me hope that he is not set in his ways, as is often said about people in this age group, but rather that he will continue to grow and change, hopefully in healthy ways. So I've chosen to dive a bit deeper into this topic specifically as it pertains to the elderly development during this stage, in the hopes that I could use this peer-reviewed article and this developmental theory to support the fact that Doug will continue to develop, that all hope is not lost, and that his quality of life can improve. So I'm going to focus on ego psychological theory, and there are 8 stages of Erik Erikson's theory, and I'm going to briefly touch on all of them and then focus on the last one, but I think that each stage is relevant, and I'll reference it, so I'll just touch on them briefly. First of all, a progression over time in terms of psychosocial development and ego tasks is necessary according to Erikson. So you would move through these stages as they're listed. In year 1, you develop a sense of trust versus mistrust, meaning that trust is developed when the child is interacting with parents and there's a safe and nurturing environment. 1 to 3 years of age, autonomy versus shame and doubt, meaning that children begin to become individuals a bit more. 4 to 5 years, initiative versus guilt is the name of this stage, and children exercise increased control over their environment during this time. 6 to 11 years of age, industry versus inferiority. So school and peer interactions and a generally expanding world are important during this stage. Adolescence is a time of identity versus role confusion. So there's a lot of dramatic physical and social, emotional changes that occur as people attempt to find meaning, find their identities, and differentiate themselves from their family. And 18 to 25 years of age, intimacy versus isolation is experienced. So it's important during this stage to successfully develop strong, intimate relationships. And then 25 to 65 years of age, which is a big chunk, is generativity versus stagnation. So it's important during this stage to have success in forming a family, raising children, developing satisfying work and community activities and engagement. And then 65 and up is ego, integrity versus despair. And this is where I'll focus most because this is the category where Doug falls. People during this stage review their lives and strive for meaning in their retirement years. And according to Erickson, and it seems logical to me as well, it would be difficult to find the meaning looking back on your life if you hadn't had a successful experience or a positive experience with the previous stages. So Erickson believed that the stages follow this biological kind of linear pattern. Erickson also believes that, not necessarily believed. Erickson based his theory largely on Western constructs of men and women and their roles. So it's important to keep in mind that it's Western, traditional Western mindset. And then there was a person named Moss. This is referenced in their reading that touched on ego-psychological theory. He acknowledged the negative impact of racism, discrimination, segregation, and lack of community resources on development. This is really important to this case as well. And he did go on to refer to people with disabilities as patients, and in terms of lost competencies, which is not empowering language, and we don't really use that. But what is really relevant is that critique that a lack of community resources will affect your development. So just to keep that in mind. And then ego-psychological theorists have primarily viewed development in a non-disabled context, so it doesn't take disability into account really, and it neglects the healthy development of persons with disabilities, so this isn't as relevant. So Doug does have some disabilities just as a result of his old age, this liver failure, difficulty with mobility, and I know he also has problems with his eyesight, so things like that limit him. So 2 examples of how this theory can apply to this case. It makes me wonder about the developmental stages of his past, especially 8 to 15, intimacy versus isolation, and forming those meaningful relationships, because he's never been married and doesn't have a family and never spoke about meaningful relationships, even close friendships. I would posit that this stage was missed or maybe not fully realized for him, and that could cause some problems with development. Also, the generativity versus stagnation stage of 25 to 65, raising kids specifically, but also kind of giving back and feeling success in your pursuits. That never really happened for him. He did reference wanting to be a famous musician and how that dream was never realized. So things like that. And it could help to know this when working with Doug, and I'll touch on that later. So those things would be useful to know. Integrity versus despair, ego, integrity versus despair, that last stage of 65 and older is relevant because I am interpreting now that gruffness, that closed offness, as a result of that stage, falling more into the despair side of that category. He definitely had a lack of motivation or direction and was just sort of resolved in a hopeless way about his fate. He was definitely at a distinct disadvantage. The systems that were in place when you're on government disability, especially in Oklahoma, and he would be frustrated by this, but really in a pretty passive and resigned way. So again, important to note in working with Doug in a social work setting. I'll touch on that in just a moment. Make sure I can get through the rest of this under time constraints. So I'm going to reference the peer-reviewed article. It's called Psychosocial Development in Adulthood, a 22-year sequential study. It's by Whitburn, Zuschlag, Elliott, and Waterman. It was done in 1991. And I'm going to just touch on the parts that are relevant to this case because I am running out of time. So it addresses adult personality stability versus stages in personality development. This is relevant to what I am trying to put forward, that Doug will continue to develop even in his old age and has hope of maybe a brighter future, a more empowered future. Different understandings of aging may be the result of different definitions of personality, and consequently a focus on different variables. So what that means is that some variables are more stable and some are more dynamic. There have been a lot of studies done on those stable personality traits and not a lot done on ones that are intended to be more dynamic. So this study tries to focus on those dynamic and changing elements of personality. Trying to make sure I hit the high points here. Further explanation of Erikson's theory, it was touched on in this study as well, but since we've already touched on that, I will spare you repeating that. According to this article, Erikson's stages do not have to be unidirectional, so this doesn't necessarily line up with what Erikson would posit, that you do need to move through progressively. This study would say that to further develop that theory, an individual's life circumstances may dictate when certain stages are reached, how long a person spends at each stage, and whether or not the individual returns to a previous stage, meaning that you could return to a previous stage and sort of find that resolution that you may be lacking. I think it's helpful to view it that way. A critique of this theory is that it lumps people into a certain age into a homogeneous personality group, so everyone who's 65 and older is going to have a certain personality type, which of course is not fair to the individual. This study is an extension of Whitburn and Waterman's 1979 analysis of psychoanalysis over time, so it's following the same group of people over 22 years. And as these different groups were formed and studied, it became clear that entering old age did come to bear on personality development, and also historical and cultural changes did as well. So essentially the results found that these historical and cultural changes played just as much of a part as the actual progression in age and getting older, and that these things came together to form the personality, but you can't disregard actually entering old age as playing a part in personality development. According to Erikson, you experience a crisis, and that spurs the further development of your personality. So taking those things into account, please look up that article, read more about it. I wish I could say more, but it spoke to what I was trying to prove. So those are the points that are most relevant here. So the cultural and social justice implications that are relevant to this case is really just Doug's socioeconomic status, because by all other accounts he was part of the dominant group, white heterosexual male. So he would often reference men he had gone to college with who were experiencing success in their current endeavors and compare himself to that, which was a challenge to him. So this likely spurred on feelings of despair instead of ego integrity in his old age. And he's not really been able to have success in business or success in family life in the way that he would like to, so those are things to take into account. Ego psychological theory could be used in Doug's case and in general to bring awareness to the difficulty that's faced by people of this socioeconomic status and of this age group. So this can be experienced across the board, and Doug is just a representative of that. So this theory is ideal for a situation that encompasses both aspects. The therapeutic interviewer or social worker could explore Doug's past to see if the previous developmental stages were missed or unresolved, and then spend time talking about that to complete those stages or to move on in a way that feels resolved and produce the ego integrity that is desired. Also working with Doug, where Doug is right now, and addressing the current developmental stage of ego integrity versus despair, would allow conversation about existing strengths and how to bring those to bear and empower Doug in that way. So thinking about what community activities he could be a part of, developing some kind of support system in his hometown, looking into even alternative housing options or employment options that could be pursued, and most importantly, using any kind of therapeutic setting to enable Doug to rework the way that he views himself and his perception of success and failure in his life, and spur him on toward empowerment and hope that those things can still happen for him, and to produce resolution in the ways that they can't. Certain things maybe he doesn't want to engage in, but just can process and feel the resolution of letting that go and feeling success where he's at this current stage. Having dreams that he can reach now. And then he can live peacefully in the realm of ego integrity, not despair, and oneness with himself. Thank you so much.